sharing a mix for this presentation of this morning and this afternoon presentation. So, what do you think that we are still able to reach a human-like agency in Baika, or what is the missing element? So, let's have some kind of.
Let me think about that for a second. Okay, generally, I'm a believer in the cognition as computation metaphor. And if I would have to bet, like if you would really force me to bet some of my hilariously low salary on whether this is going to work eventually or not, already for the sake of my soul, I probably would say, yes, I do think eventually it is possible, conceptually possible, which still doesn't mean that we will do it. It is conceptually possible to reach human-like agency in an artificial cognitive system. But probably that's the easy part of the question. Like the harder one, which probably would then cost me my salary, is the one what's missing in current cognitive systems. And probably I will regret saying this forever after, but having had quite some discussions lately with people from developmental psychology, people who, for example, are working on the development of sense of agency, I more and more get the impression that among the many things which we currently don't get right in cognitive architectures, like I also don't believe that emotions actually are just a mathematical value of a threshold function, but one of the things which I believe make it possible for us to be the type of cognitive agent we are is actually phenomenology. And I now don't want to go down all the strong Heideggerian and all the partially mythical, partially esoterical road, but phenomenology in the sense of getting feedback from our environment which goes beyond a mere mathematical value and which goes beyond getting feedback for things the architect foresaw. So if you have a child walking around somewhere and, for example, it puts its fingers on a hot stove, rest assured, or at least this is what I believe, pain sensors were never foreseen to precisely know how it feels to put the fingers on precisely the stove and precisely get this impression. Nonetheless, you have a strong feedback which allows you to learn. And you can generalize that. You can also draw this over into motivations. You can draw this over into drives. So some notion beyond what we as engineers can foresee and for what we can thus account in terms of feedback systems is one of the things I would say is still missing and of which we don't even have a real idea because we, for example, seemingly don't even really know what sense of agency is. Like we don't even have an ontological account. Okay, may I hand over now?
Wow, follow that. You know, when you started, I have to say, I thought, okay, so you said you subscribe to the computational approach, and I thought, okay, fine. But you ended up in a completely different place talking about phenomenology. So I agree completely with everything you said after you said I subscribe to the computational approach. Because I don't. I'm much more aligned with the emergent side, and I do think that we will achieve human level cognition in artifacts, but not in my lifetime. But it will happen. Of that I am convinced. And what's missing is more formalisms. I think we need to start taking the modeling process seriously and treat it as, you know, strong science, the way we did with natural philosophy 300 years ago, and make some attempt to capture phenomenology, because I believe with you, I'm totally phenomenal in the strong phenomenological tradition. I think that that's the key to this. It's the middle path between the two the two approaches that we see classically battling it out. And I do think that it can be captured somehow in a mathematical. We just need the right calculus. I'm not sure we have the right calculus yet, but we should be searching for it because I think it's the only way we'll ever do it. So I'm convinced we're going to do it. That's why I spend my life doing this. But we need smarter young people with a strong sense of mathematical modeling in the true sense. Then we will have a language to have a discussion. Then I think. Sorry.
Yeah, I also think that we will get there sometime. But I also feel that the progress is incredibly slow. And my sense is that every time we come together again, we're sort of bringing up the same. We know there is a problem. We know we need something new and different, but it's like we're not quite there. I had an interesting experience in my class. I teach cognitive psychology, and I invited a young AI researcher to come and explain his cognitive architecture, and he was trying to put attention into the architecture. And it was interesting because my students had so many ideas and feedback that he had not even thought about. So I'm wondering if maybe a tiny part of the problem is a lack of more communication and cooperation between those that are actually working with cognition in humans and those that are modeling. I mean, I know there is, of course, cooperation and all of that, but sometimes I feel like there is a lack of knowledge on both parts, and we would definitely benefit from a little bit more cooperation and just talking to each other.
Okay, well, I think that in this discussion we are kind of mixing two kind of concepts. The first one is human-like computation, and the second one is human-level results. So I believe that currently we have a human-level AI system, or even superhuman-level AI system, in which are very smart in doing very narrow tasks. We have a Watson system that is able to do question answering. We have the Google system able to do AlphaGo. So, but it's like what we miss is the kind of general intelligence that we possess as humans. So we are let's say suboptimal in a certain sense. And the way to achieve this kind of suboptimal let's say intelligence, but it is important from an evolutionary perspective, is in my opinion it passes for the realization of structural models of cognition from a biologically that are both biologically inspired and cognitively inspired. So I think that in certain cases machines are really outperforms humans in many tasks. But we should look at let the machines, let the system doing things that we do without apparently any effort. I think that is the kind, the class of problems that need this kind of architectural perspective, and that need this kind of let's say integrations between cognition, biologically inspired computing, and AI.
So to summarize, so you think that we need some more attention to phenomenology, something like this. Yes. And you, David, think that there is more serious mathematical background in some sense, some kind of. You think that there is more relationship, more link between cognitive science, between psychologists and computer scientists in some sense. And you, Antonio, thinks more about we have to take into account the role of general intelligence. So these are four recipes which, in my opinion, do make sense. and very different anyway. But going back to phenomenology, for example. So, David, you don't mention anything about self or consciousness in your 10 points.
No, I never mentioned the C word. I'm nervous of it. I'm nervous because, and I know it's a valid scientific endeavor to do computational modeling of consciousness, and that's where Anil Seth probably made his greatest sign. But very few of the papers that I've read on that needed the word consciousness. You could have replaced it with cognition, and not much would have changed actually in the underlying model. And I think I've heard very few plausible examples of models of what consciousness is. The only one that I really made me say, yes, that's plausible, was the one at the very end of Maturana and Varela's book, The Tree of Knowledge. And most people don't get to the end of it, and they should, because there's a little sting in the tail you do not expect. And they were phenomenologists. They were both phenomenologists. And Varela tried very hard to formalize phenomenology with the calculus of indications and Spencer Brown's calculus of indications. And he really didn't solve it, and I think he was disappointed, but he was onto something. Anyway, the point was that he had invoked recursion and reentrance, and that's how he made it work. I don't think we have, I think that's a far dream. I'll keep my aspirations at a lower level. Cognition's hard enough for me. I don't disrespect the thing, but I just think it's too far, that's all.
Also, I have to say that everyone who read the Maturana and Varela book says I have a different interpretation. So, in my opinion, we should have a conference on the Maturana book, so, because everyone has his own interpretation on this one. So. And anyway, I think that moving from as you suggest, moving from the computational aspects of cognition more to the foundation, more to the equation, let's say, aspect of cognition, is interesting, but is in some sense there could be some problem with when people do cognitive architecture, because the idea of doing cognitive architecture in some sense to get some kind of implementation model, some cognitive model that could be implemented in a system, and it's not really true that there is always a kind of equation. So there are two different models. There are two different levels of modeling. There are modeling based on equation and modeling based on a program. And I have an artificial intelligence background, and I have to say that typically in AI there are less equation. There are no equation essentially, but there are computational model. And this is one of the faults, one of the problem of AI. And so I would like to ask you, Camillo, which is you are a professional psychologist. So, in your opinion, studying human level cognition, for you is better to have a sort of representation based on equations, or a representation based on models, on the computational models? From your view.
Well, I'm intrigued with the increased emphasis on equations. I'm not exactly sure what this would mean for me and my work.
Because you employ the computer in order to make a measurement for people. So it's the opposite.
Would it be too much to ask, David, could you give an example of each one?
Each one?
Like if you had like a model based more on equation, or?
Okay. Okay, so yeah, I mean, so to reinterpret, what do you mean? What does it mean to formalize a model of cognition? Okay, so I think it's first very important that people understand there are two types of model. There are descriptive models, and there are normative models. Descriptive models come up with faithful representations of that, but faithful accounts of how something behaves, viewed from the outside. And they're happy with that, because it gives them something which has a predictive capability and, to an extent, an explanatory one, and that's fine. And quite a lot of psychology works with those descriptive models. But then there's normative models, and these models have an agenda. They've got something to sell. They've got a hypothesis about how something works inside. And when I talk about formalisms, I'm talking about the normative concept. It's the inside. It is what are the normative mechanisms by which that behavior is enacted, or by which it arises. So I think I need to clarify that. So that's the context in which I made my statement. So now, can I give you an example? All right. So I mentioned earlier in my talk about this book that I'm reading on curiosity, which I think is a fundamental drive in development. It is the thing, and it is not purely innate. It also has to have the ontogenetic environment to facilitate that. If children aren't answered, they stop becoming curious. So there are two facets to that at least. But you can characterize curiosity by looking at it from an information theoretic perspective, which is surprisal. Am I surprised by something? Does this match what I expected? So you can look at it from that perspective. So you can model, I believe, epistemic or curiosity with information theoretic concepts based on, for example, entropy, uncertainty, surprisal, mutual information, and those things. And that's a calculus, and it's a formalism. It's not an equation yet, because, okay, that's the final step. But at least finding the right formalism is a place to begin. And curiosity could be encapsulated with the information theoretic concept of surprisal. That's one example.
Okay. So from the point of view of psychology, I find that sometimes we need to kind of be able to step outside of the box. We are all, of course, in our own little boxes, working with our own little whatever we are interested in, whether it's semantic memory or something else. So normative models, I think, maybe sometimes could be helpful to see some possible solution completely in a different light. So in that sense, I think they may be good. Not just if we have descriptive models, then we are always just describing what we see inside our little box. And so maybe this, in that sense, it can be helpful.
Yeah, no, well, I think that with respect to the David dichotomy, we may have different, let's say, formalism in order to describe even normative models. The point is that if we assume a pluralistic scientific perspective, we may develop different kinds of models for this different kind of formalism for modeling this kind of normative aspect, and then probably by using this kind of pluralistic account, we can select which model fits better for modeling which kind of normative function and which not. I mean, so, and this is important in the integration part, I think. So since we are going to build agent, I mean, even the way in which we integrate these different kind of models, I mean, we may have, let's say, one best solution for everything, so we can have one formalism that is that allows us to model all the normative aspects, and then for some reason is better with respect to other formalisms. And or we may have this kind of pluralistic perspective. I think that to have this kind of pluralistic perspective allows us even to choose when in different cases, when we have to build real system, it is the case of using one formalism and one other formalism.
Yeah, so for example, talking about a normative model, Stark, you today presented some kind of model which is not, which is in some sense is a normative model of analogy. So it's more related with the logical tradition in some sense than in. But what do you think about this, the use of normative models in human level?
Okay. Yeah, sure. Like I would have expected David to actually distinguish two different types of models. I wouldn't have bet that you would go for normative versus descriptive. I would rather have bet that you would go for runnable versus non-runnable. Where descriptive models very often aren't runnable, yes, are not runnable, which is why I consider it funny that you still give them explanatory characteristics to a certain extent, while normative models very often are runnable by, well, not by coincidence, but by the characteristics they have. So today, during my talk, like for some of the people who presumably were in the amazing tutorial Frank Ritter gave, I presented a very classical logic-based model of computational analogy making, which later on I in my own talk disqualified as implausible because it's computationally intractable. So still I try to make the point that it's not invalidated by it. It might not qualify as a model of strong AI or of human level capacities or what have you, but I still maintain that it still can have certain explanatory capacities, always keeping in mind that it is implausible due to certain other constraints. So with this qualification, the model can still be good for something. So one of the things I greatly enjoyed reading, I dissent with the opinions there, but I greatly enjoyed reading, is a book by David Deutsch, in which he basically, in the mid-noughts, makes the point that instead of so much focusing on descriptive modeling, what AI should rather be looking for is explanations. Which goes a bit in the direction you were using there, but it's way more loaded as a term and it brings a couple of connotations you don't want to go for. Nonetheless, modeling in the explanatory sense and being cautious not to misread normative as actually excluding other models is, I think, the way how you actually can gain A, insight, in the sense at least I'm looking for it, but B, also how you can advance our science. Thus, when distinguishing between having an equation and having what I would call a runnable model, I would always go for the runnable model. But I actually also don't think that when David said descriptive models with equations, he meant something, yeah, exactly, but you used both terms at some point. So you said equations, and you said descriptive models at some point, not in... Not at the same time. Yeah, no, not in direct conjunction. But you never actually, or at least this is how I heard it, you also said that you would want to have a mathematically well-founded calculus, which already is hinting again in the procedural direction. Like it's not that you're... I don't know whether you're happy, for example, with a model like ICSI, Markus Hütter's perfectly rational agent, which is a mathematical formulation, decision theoretic, in my opinion, non-computable for two independent reasons, but it is a perfect rational agent. Nonetheless, I don't think this is the mathematics you would necessarily aim for.
Do you want me to? I'll try and be very brief. First of all, with respect to descriptive models, I think their explanatory value is weak, but I don't want to claim it's zero, so I was being cautious. Okay. When I spoke of formalisms, I was only confining my remarks to the normative. And I conceive these to be the runnable ones. So, okay, just to be clear, so I can use exactly your taxonomy as well. It's the same thing, and that's why I'm interested in the normative, because they're runnable. Whether or not I like somebody's normative model and the agenda they're selling is irrelevant if it works. I really don't want to, I don't care about that. I mean, it's, if it works and it explains and it replicates the behavior that we see in natural agents, I'm sold. Okay, I don't have to like it. Whether or not it can be computable, I think is actually an almost irrelevant question. I don't want to confine any exploration of a natural phenomenon to computability. I mean, there may be more to life than is dreamt of in that particular philosophy. So I don't know. But as long as we're going to simulate them on von Neumann computers, well, then we've got a problem. But they're only simulations. They're not it's not the thing in itself. So if you're happy with that distinction, you can still make an awful lot of progress. I mean, climate control is a perfect example. You don't have to create a hurricane to model a hurricane and understand that. You don't have to. Yeah, okay, I could go on. I won't.
I would like to hear from some reaction from the audience. And Olivier, I'm sure that you would like to say something about the model.
Just my current thought, listening to you. Maybe a corollary question is, how do you think we could prove when we have managed to achieve human-level agents? What will be our criteria? If somebody in the room today said, I managed to implement human-level intelligence, how could he prove it? And how could you maybe falsifiate this claim and so on? What are the scientific criteria that we are aiming at?
Who want to say something?
Well, okay. We are talking about human level intelligence. So one way to have an evaluation is compare the results. In this case, compare the results of achieved by an artificial system to, let's say, experimental results coming from psychology for particular task, and see whether and to what extent, okay, this level of results is achieved.
Yeah, I realize I have to bring some complementary to complement my question. Because of course we are talking about the Turing test, but the Turing tests. So maybe when we achieve that, maybe not in our lifetime, someday we'll be able to create a machine that passes the Turing test. But the problem is, what are the intermediary levels? What will be how can we know that we are on the right path to this direction? And is there any intermediary test or intermediary scientific experiment that we can do to show that we are on the right path?
Okay, I don't have an answer, but I have a suggestion that comes from a very simple example. The way in which in a computational system in the AI we model, for example, abduction, okay? There are different ways for modeling this kind of reasoning, or modeling induction, or in general modeling common sense reasoning. For example, in the early 70s, there was the development of this formalism known as the fuzzy logic, okay, fuzzy logic-based formalisms. Well, to certain extents, this kind of formalisms modeled some aspects of our cognition, but they were completely implausible from a cognitive point of view. And one aspect that probably could suggest us that we are going in, let's say, the wrong direction. I don't know if the term wrong is correct, but one insight can come from the fact that, for example, we as humans, okay, employ very simple, fast heuristics in order to produce this kind of reasoning, okay? While logic-based formalism that have been developed in this area, even the argumentation theory, are often intractable, okay? This is a symptom of a problem, in my opinion. This is a symptom of the fact that the way in which we execute a given cognitive function, okay, uses somehow a different formalisms, okay, different formalism with respect to the way the formalism that we are going to use in the realization of an artificial system, showing the same level of capability in that task. So this is a symptom, let's say this is a symptomatic fact, I think. So it's a symptom that suggests us that we probably should use another formalism, okay, in order to divide not only a Newman level agent, but also a Newman-like agent. I mean, often in order to achieve a Newman-level intelligence in general, in more general cases, we must take into account really which are the heuristics and try to hypothesize which are the underlying formalism that we can use and that we can model even in our systems.
I'm very curious to say to ask people. Talking about a human level intelligence, one of the main aspect, in my opinion, is the aspect of language. So if I have before myself one human level intelligence, my view is that I can in some sense discuss with him, talk with him. So what is the role of language in these aspects, in your opinion? So if someone could, Carlos, do you want to say something about this? Yeah. I'm sure that Carlos would like to say something.
Thank you. There are some hypotheses that say that language is not a phenomena itself. It's not only communication. It's again, just like with narrative, it's something that happens with communication. It's a way of adapting for us. So it's kind of an action in that sense. Okay. So to me, I really believe that in order to achieve this human level agency or whatever you call it, you need language. But in my opinion, I have always thought that it doesn't have to be this kind of spoken language that we use. It doesn't have to be like that. It could, of course, and that could be more human-like, absolutely, and it will help us communicate with machines. But it's not the case. I think that as long as we manage to have computers use any kind of language for communicating with others and for communicating to themselves, and that's some kind of consciousness, if you will, I think that is a very relevant part, and to me, that's necessary for human-level agency. So that's my view on that. Thank you.
Before concluding, I would like to ask Alexei, what is your feeling about this human-like agency?
Yeah, so I would like to continue this discussion of the dichotomy that David brought up. First, I completely agree that we need formalism, a unique standard for developing cognitive architecture before we can make any substantial progress. But I was not sure where you were coming from, but I originally received my training in physics, in theoretical physics, and there is a well-known dichotomy there, which is between phenomenological models and micro-theoretical models. That's one-to-one maps onto your normative versus descriptive. Well, maybe runnable, not runnable, I'm not sure. Actually, you can run both. You can write equations for a phenomenological model, like theory of Ginzburg-Landau of superconductivity, and run them simulating the phenomenon, but it does not explain you the nature of this phenomenon, right? So what I think we need in BICA is to capture the nature of the cognitive phenomena, not just to replicate the phenomenology, which in a sense was done multiple times. And I can give again, this my favorite today, negative examples of of the Spawn project, and which is the best, I guess, but the rest are much more famous and much more expensive, like big brain, blue brain, human brain that takes billions of dollars, billions of neurons, and yet get us nothing, I think. So those would be descriptive models in your terminology, right? And they, yeah, because we don't know whether they or maybe I should ask Kate, who is probably the only specialist here from neuroscience. Maybe she can express her opinion after me, right? But yes, I am in favor of designing the new micro-theoretical approach, or in your terminology, normative approach to capture the phenomena of the brain. Yes, and this is what you need.
Yeah, well, I'm not fully sure how much progress has been made with the Human Brain Project or the Blue Brain Project, and I guess the idea is to build something that has the same architecture as the brain and see whether it does what the brain does. That's my understanding of what they're trying to do. And
we never know what parameters matter. We never, you can replicate maybe one kind of behavior, like solving particular task, but you cannot get it to learn like a human child and acquire.
I completely agree. I mean, I think we've got to go a long way beyond just kind of reconstructing another brain. I mean, you can do that. We do that every generation. We construct a whole bunch of new human beings and they behave like human beings, but we wouldn't say that we were creating intelligence that we understand. We don't know how the brains of our children work. So you need at some level to be able to describe the things that you've simulated in a different way to show that you really understand how they're working and what they're doing, and be able to maybe reconstruct it in a different format. And until you've done that, you've not really understood it.
Yeah, so I believe we need a model that is computational, which means you can implement it in a computer, and which brings us understanding of the mechanism, of the true mechanism of our mind. Maybe these two requirements must be both satisfied. It is runnable and faithful to the nature of our cognition. And then we can hope that the model itself may exceed its designer by multiple orders of magnitude in, let's say, its ability to reproduce phenomena that originally were not even linked to it. Like you designed a model that can answer question, and somehow it is useful for driving a car, for example. So I'm talking about the possibility of realizing your belief in a self-organizing system, in evolutionary systems, right, that can grow on their own. And the question is, again, I'm coming back to the same question, what's the critical mass for that? What's the minimal requirement? Maybe we do not need billions of neurons with ion channels, all biologically realistic. We never are sure what parts of them are necessary, right? But maybe we need something else that can further develop on its own, starting with some minimal basic principles. What do you think?
Another point is, for example, AI is full of normative systems, if you consider normative systems like logical systems. And so we have to distinguish between, in my opinion, inside normative systems, which are more explain the operation of the brain or not. Because in AI, there are a lot of formal systems in this way. So, concluding word? Maybe we can do the last round and in order to conclude it.
Okay, let me quote Bertolt Brecht. The curtain closes and all questions are open.
I don't think, in a sense, I'd like to echo that, because I think we should not have closed minds to any particular approach. I think we should keep our minds open to everything, whether or not we think it's plausible. But the one thing that I do think is essential to discriminate between, and that is the instantiation of a theory and the theory itself. And a lot of what goes by the way of normative modeling are instantiations, and people make very big claims because of that. I think the progress will come when we unveil the principles behind that. In exactly the same way as I think this was the agenda of the cyberneticians originally, and I think we've lost and forgotten a lot of what they learned for us, and I think we would be well advised to return to some of the early and the second order cybernetics world today with a completely new view. And maybe we'll see things through different eyes, as Proust said.
Okay, no, well, I agree with David. In one sentence, I would conclude that, in my opinion, in order to achieve a human-level artificial general intelligence, we need to have a human-like approach to the modeling. That this means to cover all these aspects that we have discussed so far.
Okay. So now it's time for the coffee break. So thank you for all the panelists and all the audience. So thank you.